Historical background. Prehistory. By nature, Filipinos were and perhaps still are tribalistic, termed mildly as regionalistic. This attitude brought about antagonisms between ethnic and regional groups. If it is happening at present, undoubtedly it also happened in the past. However, in the absence of Filipino records regarding this disunity, there is no other recourse but to depend on foreign sources. Prior to the coming of the Spaniards, there had been a number of foreigners either residing or making business in the islands. These were the Indonesians, Borneans, Malaysians, Arabians, Orang Dampuans, Chinese, Sumatrans, Japanese, and possibly the Portuguese. Among these foreigners, the Chinese had recorded their voyage to the archipelago, in the famous Chu Fan Chi, compiled by Chao Ju Kwa. Mamichua D. Saber also told the author of this thesis that on his trip to Sumatra he was presented an ancient record, which contains the account about the travels of the 10 Bornean Datus. However, the record shows that there were only 9 Datus. Because as the Maragdas has it, Datu Puti returned to Borneo and was never heard of again. In short, there were only 9 Datus missing then. Other foreigners who have been here prior to the coming of the Spaniards were the Japanese. Of course, when Miguel López de Legazpi arrived in Manila, records show that there was a number of Japanese living in the place. But the length of residence in the archipelago is uncertain. Tahiro Fukuda, vice president of the Meiji Gakuin University of Japan, told the author that their ancient records contain the voyages made by their ancestors to the Philippines. However, he said, he forgot the name by which the Philippines was known to the Japanese travelers. Of these records only the Chinese and the Spanish records are available to the author. The Chinese records did not contain any account about inter-Barangay conflicts. The Spanish records on the other hand are replete with accounts that had been recorded during their stay in the archipelago. Historians claim that prior there was a conflict of the Filipinos with the Orang Dampuans. However, the sources of this allegation are ambiguous. The first verifiable account happened during the arrival of Ferdinand Magellan, the conflict between Lapu-Lapu of Mactan and Humabon of Cebu. Their conflict did not only start when Magellan came. According to the local history of Mactan, Lapu-Lapu was not a Cebuano. He is believed to be a Muslim pirate with Mactan as his base. Hence, according to the oral history of Mactan, the people of Cebu resented the presence of Lapu-Lapu near their area. However, the study of Heidi K. Gloria entitled, Lapu-Lapu, an interpretation in folklore methodology did not mention about the tribal origin of Lapu-Lapu. What is important is that historians agree that this tribal conflict terminated the long and daring life of Magellan. Spanish period. After the arrival of the Spaniards, these conflicts still persisted. Later on worsened and became inter-religious and interracial struggle. Spanish records give us a picture of how military intelligence was employed by both antagonists. The most simple intelligence operation recorded was espionage. Although early records do not refer to it as espionage, the nature of operations conducted implied that they were indeed espionage. After a meticulous scrutiny of early documents, it was found that one of the early recorded intelligence activities of the natives was scouting. Scouting is part of espionage utilized during combat operations. Another record reveals the use of envoys. The present equivalent of this operative is a courier or messenger. These two terms are indications of the employment of intelligence in its simplest form. But there are no indications that there was a formal intelligence services organized. Magellan through his spies, he knew that Lapu-Lapu had dug ditches along the beaches as their defense strategy. But in this encounter Lapu-Lapu won, therefore he must have a better espionage ring than that of Humabon or Magellan. The information he got enabled him to use the right tactic in deploying his men, aside from their desire to resist any foreign impositions. Through his spies, he was able to know the weakness of Spanish defense. They knew too well that their spears and bow and arrow were no match with the guns and the steel armor of the foreigners. They must find the right strategy in order to win. So, as strategy, his men were ordered to hit the legs, because these were not covered. Pit traps were also dug around their houses aside from the beach trenches. With power in numbers and the tenacity of his men, as well as right strategy due to timely intelligence, Lapu-Lapu was victorious. It is immortalized as the first anti-imperialist defense of the Filipinos. Learning from the experiences of those who came before him, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, after making friendship with native leaders, also employed the natives as spies in the guise of a simple messenger. Aside from bringing the message of Legazpi, they acted as his eyes and ears, thus he knew the condition of his men in the advance parties. The natives were not the only workers of Legazpi in gathering information. The missionaries were also utilized as spies. But they were of a special type of agents, for they could grant pardon to the rebellious ones. It could be spiritual and temporal, of course. One Spanish account gives the name of Fray Pedro Camacho to be a messenger of Sabina Manriquez de Lara. On the part of the natives whom the Spaniards called Indios, the use of spies was also popular. Francisco Maniago, a chief of the village of Mexico, Pampanga, sent his spies to the provinces of Pangasinan and Ilocos urging them to follow their example, that is to fight against the Spaniards. They even used their traditional priests, Catalanan, for propaganda purposes. The account says these priests Catalanans told them Filipinos that if they would attack the Spaniards, the Diwata would cause the mountain to rise against their foe, that the muskets of the latter would not go off, or else the bullets would rebound on those who fire them, that if any Indian should die the demon would resuscitate him, that the leaves of the tree would be converted into saranga, which is a large fish. They used disguises too. The followers of Maniago, for example, used masks to conceal their identity. Spanish records show different nomenclatures of native spies. These different nomenclatures appeared to signify their class status within their community. For those who belonged to the prominent families were called envoys. Those who were sent abroad, they were termed as ambassadors. However, for those who were employed locally and without any importance within the native society, records term them as mere couriers. Nevertheless, whatever their social status, either employed by the Spaniards or the Filipino chiefs, their functions were the same: gathering and relaying information. Another kind of agents employed frequently was the scouts. In military parlance, scouts and guides are those responsible in leading and guiding their units during combat operations. They are always ahead of the group. Actually, the Filipino chiefs did not need these men, for they were also knowledgeable about their terrain, so scouts in Spanish records were mostly in the service of the Spaniards. According to these records, these men were called guides. Humabon, for example, gave Magellan some of his men as guides. Pigafetta was not at all ignorant of military terms, because anybody who does not belong to the unit is really called as guide. This kind of agents is responsible for combat intelligence, for they knew how to enter a territory and how to get out in case of retreat. Moros. The Muslims, whom the Spaniards called Moros, arrived in the country ahead of the Spaniards. The term Moro is derived corrupted, from the word Moors, the people of Morocco. For the Spaniards, any Muslim is a Moro, hence, even though the inhabitants of Mindanao may not have been from Morocco but converts of Islam, they called them Moros just the same. The ability of the Moros to speak Arabic, a must for every Muslim, made them good interpreters for the Spaniards. On the one hand, since they knew the geography of the Philippines and Malay dialect, the lingua franca of the Filipinos, they were really suited to the position. The Spaniards, on the other hand, also understood Arabic because they themselves were under Islamic domination for 781 years. The Moros were employed as couriers, guides, messengers, informers, and in many other capacities. The invaders in their imperial design for the archipelago co-opted them. Gómez Porras das Marinas, for example, employed the Moros to attack Moluccas. Whatever their employment within the Spanish forces, it will not alter the fact that the Muslims were the first to rise in defiance to foreign domination. Their resistance persisted up to the time of the Americans. History has the names of Lacandula, Solomon, Sultan Kudarat, Jikiri, Datu Yuto, and Magomat Muhammad always ring a bell to every Filipino. The Moros did not only serve the Spaniards. They were hired by the Filipino datas too. Raja Tupas of Cebu, for example, had a Moro as his deputy chief. Although Spanish records appeared to delineate them from the rest of the cultural communities, it must noted here that these Moros were inhabitants of the archipelago too, therefore their resistance against the invaders was also part of the overall resistance of the natives of the islands against foreign domination. The only difference was that, they are Muslims. Chinese. The Muslims were not the only group of people who collaborated with the Spaniards, the Chinese also did in a number of capacities. In fact, they were not only hired but they even volunteered their services to the Spaniards, thinking perhaps and if they will collaborate with the invaders they will be given special treatment. One account shows a Chinese informing the Spaniards under Governor Francisco de Sandy for the impending peril so that the Spaniards can fortify themselves. Like the Moros, they were hired as guides too. But this relationship did not last long. It was strained by the attack of Limahong. After that, the Chinese were blacklisted, a number were deported while others were massacred. It took a long time for the Spaniards to trust again the Chinese, and when they did, the Chinese became their partners in abusing the Filipinos. Japanese. There were Japanese too during the Spanish regime. During the early pacification period, records show a Japanese who disclosed the planned conspiracy under the leadership of a certain Azueda. Another account relates the complicity of a Japanese in a plot and rebellion against the Spaniards by Don Agustin and Martin Ponga, the native chief of Tonda. Like the Moros and the Chinese, their involvement in the events of the early Filipino society was also dual. On October 4, 1603, the Chinese at Parayan revolted. This was repulsed with the help of the Japanese. Centuries later, the Japanese were instrumental in the strengthening of the Filipino conviction to go on with the revolution through their promised supply of arms and ammunition. This did not materialize. But the effect of it in the psyche of the revolutionaries was very positive. Bornines. The role of the Bornines, on the other hand, must not be overlooked. They were recorded to have encouraged Lecontula and Solomon to revolt against the Spaniards. In another account, a certain Pedro Ladaya, a native of Borneo, promoted sedition against the Spaniards. The failures of these rebellions and the retaliations of the Spaniards stopped the Bornines in meddling in the internal affairs of the archipelago. But these did not stop the Filipinos from soliciting aid from Borneo. It was in these aid campaigns that native agents were sent to solicit the support of the Bornines. One of these agents was Maget Salamat. The chiefs of Luzon sent him with gifts to the king of Borneo. This relationship could not have been made possible without constant communication going on for a time. This was intelligence work, of course. Early intelligence works. As the Spaniards tightened their grip on the archipelago, more and more Spaniards flocked into the islands. As intelligence developed, official reports started to sound like real military reports. If in the earlier chronicles the terms envoys, messengers, and ambassadors implied spies, later, the term spy appeared in their reports. One particular report was the report of a certain Hernando Miguel to Spain. It said, among others, there came a spy sent by the chiefs to ascertain the purpose of the Spaniards. The spy, Ispia, appeared greatly pleased. Evaluating this statement, it appeared that the spy was then operating in the open as the present military attachés are doing in foreign countries. But there is another account of covert operation. This is about the report concerning a native sent by their leader Batala in order to find out what the Castilians are doing there. With these few examples, we can assume therefore that overt and covert intelligence operations were in practice then. Slowly the Filipinos learned the effective use of secret agents or spies. Since spies knew the terrain of their area of operations, they were employed as guides during Spanish campaigns. Aside from being hired as guides, they were also sent as infiltrators by the native chiefs. An example of this infiltrator was Simakio. In order to infiltrate, Simakio was recorded to have offered his services to the Spanish guide. However, instead of leading the Spaniards to the intended place, he led them to a deserted place away from the target. For the others who later succeeded in infiltrating enemy territories, they able to sabotage enemy equipment by stealing them. To escape detection, deception was employed. They concealed stolen iron, for example, inside their clothing. To hide their identity, they wore masks. The inability of the Spaniards to understand the Filipino dialects forced them to hire interpreters. Yet, being new to the islands, it was hard for them to identify a loyal Filipino from an enemy. With this situation, Filipinos found chances for propaganda during Spanish pacification meetings when they were utilized as interpreters. One incident on record was about an interpreter who was ordered to interpret to the people that the Spanish officials would grant pardon to the rebels, for the sake of avoiding bloodshed. Instead, the interpreter told the people the reverse of the message. It resulted in the capture of all Spanish officials present. If these few examples represent the achievements of the conquered Filipinos in the field of intelligence, the Moros must have a more effective intelligence because they were not subjugated at all. In the campaigns of the Spaniards against the Moros, particularly Sultan Kudarat, known to them as Sultan Kudarat, espionage, sabotage, and counterintelligence were put into action by these Moros. The inability of the Spaniards to subjugate these Moros is enough proof of the effectiveness of their intelligence operations. According to records, when their coast watchers saw Spanish fleets, runners were dispatched right away to inform their leader for proper actions. As dissatisfaction against Spanish colonizers grew, rebellions were observed all throughout their regime, which reached its climax during the Philippine Revolution. First phase of the Philippine Revolution. With the political development in Europe and the unanswered demand for reforms, independence was believed to be the only solution of the suffering of the inhabitants of the archipelago. This time the natives started to identify themselves as Filipinos. It was at this period that Andres Bonifacio and other Masons organized a secret society called the Katastasang Kagalangalang Katipunan ng Mga Anak ng Bayan, KKK, or the Katipunan. Being a secret organization, intelligence played an important role in the preservation of the movement. Secret name. In any subversive organization like the KKK, secrecy was a must. As a rule, new members did not even know the person whom they had taken their oath. Recruitment was vertical in nature, which means that the new members knew their recruiter only. According to Teodoro A. Agoncillo in his Revolt of the Masses, the method, procedures, and structure of the Katipunan drew its inspiration from Masonry in matters of initiation rites, and partly from Rizal's La Liga Filipina. Members were given their membership name, in which they were known by their recruiter and other members. Further, they were likewise forbidden to reveal their respective names to anybody. This name became their nom de guerre or war name during the start of the revolution. An example of this was Emilio Aguinaldo. His secret name was Magdalo, the same name by which he was known to the members. Andres Bonifacio was May Pag-asa, Emilio Jacinto was Pinkian, Mariano Alvarez was Maynam, Santiago Alvarez was Apoy, and Artemio Ricart was Vibera, to name a few. The use of secret names secured the members and their families from harassment by the enemies, aside of course from deceiving their enemies. Secret code. Katipuneros used secret codes as a means to secure the secrecy of their messages and their records. The concrete example of these records is the controversial minutes of the Katipunan, which allegedly used the code of Emilio Jacinto. For an example, please refer to the appendices. Hand signs. For recognition purposes, Katipunan members used the following hand signs. A. If the right hand is clenched with the thumb extended, this shows that he belongs to the first grade or degree. B. If the hand is clenched and the thumb is on top of the index finger, this shows that he belongs to the second grade or degree. C. If the hand is clenched and the thumb, index finger, and middle fingers extended, this shows that the belongs to the third grade or degree. These hand signals were not only used for identification purposes but also in case of trouble or when a member needed help. Espionage. As a secret organization, there was a need to know the strength, weakness, and order of battle of the Spaniards. To acquire these information, Bonifacio and Emilio Jacinto employed spies. In the different offices of the Spanish government, even in their secret service and the headquarters of the Carabinero, Katipunan spies could be found. Bonifacio succeeded in this. One time Bonifacio asked a recommendation from the priest of Santa Cruz so that Julio Navarro would be hired as a member of the Spanish Secret Service. Emilio Jacinto on the other hand successfully obtained a recommendation too from his professor at San Juan de Letran for a Katipunero to be hired by the Spanish Secret Service. This enabled the Katipunan to know the plans of the Spanish government. These were perhaps the people who deserted the Spanish forces in some encounters and joined instead with the Katipuneros. It appeared that these agents were not so efficient because they were not able to warn the Katipuneros of the impending Spanish arrests when the Katipunan was exposed. Nevertheless, the efforts alone of planting spies within Spanish Secret Service show the importance given by Bonifacio and Jacinto to intelligence. Aside from the aforementioned, the least known is Miguel Leduc. His organization was the first intelligence service, which supplied also the revolutionaries with needed logistics. When Aguinaldo learned of this, he was later appointed as the director of insurgent communication with the rank of brigadier general. He had his office in Manila. He was later treacherously pointed out by a Moro named Sarif Abdullah. But the point here is that, Aguinaldo took only the opportunity of Leduc's services but he did not organize them himself. Propaganda. When it comes to propaganda, the Katipuneros had the newsletter Calayan as its propaganda publication, under the leadership of Emilio Jacinto. Their pen aims were in Tagalog because their medium of communication was Tagalog too. Macario Sakay took charge in the distribution of this. However, it had only one issue. They may have other forms of propaganda, but the records are not explicit about them. Password. The Katipuneros used Tagalog as their medium of communication. Even in their password Tagalog was used, viz. Tanong ng at nan tandang. Challenge of the guard rooster. Sagat ng dumating o masasalyabang sa sabungin, answer of the one who comes or one being met fighter. Tanong magandang. Question good. Sagat hapon kung umaga, at umaga kung hapon, era kung gabi at gabi kung era. Answer afternoon if morning, morning if afternoon, morning if night, and night if morning. Signal. To communicate with the men in rank on what to do, the leaders of the Katipunan adopted a signal system. The communication instruments that were used were the tumbili Filipino horn or trumpet made of horn or the corneta cornet or bugle. The following were the signals. 1 long sound assembly of KKK. 1 long 1 short advance towards the enemy line. 1 short 1 long 1 short question and answer if they are near to its other, sign of recognition. Rapid sound attack and no retreat. 1 long 1 short and 1 longest, retreat. Actually the same instrument was used to inform the people if enemies were coming. Women and children. Men did not have the monopoly of patriotism. Women and children had their shares too. Among their other contributions, they too, were utilized in intelligence. Example, they spread wrong information. An incident in point was the case of a certain Matandang borough. When the Spanish soldiers were killed, their absence caused the dispatch of more soldiers into their area. When asked, Matandang borough told the Spaniards that they saw 2 soldiers going to some direction away from the direction where the Katipuneros were hiding. Women were also employed as talaba or lookouts or simply guards. The children on the hand, because of their innocent features, were employed as informers and messengers. Second phase of the Revolution and Filipino-American War. During the second phase of the Philippine Revolution and the Filipino-American War, the intelligence procedures employed by the Filipinos were still similar with the first phase of the Philippine Revolution, however this time it was institutionalized. Aguinaldo did this by a number of proclamations issued related to espionage. The basic intelligence strategy adopted then was the lookout system. Guards were assigned in strategic places to observe the movements of the enemies and report them to the chiefs for proper action. They would be found hiding in the trees or concealed in bushes near the seashore. Any enemy movement was immediately reported to their leaders. The reports gathered were used in preparation of the defense plan and the order of battle of the revolutionaries. To ensure that there will be no disruption of their occupational activities, like farming and carpentry, the leaders saw to it that while others were given their respective assignments, those who were not on duty must continue their usual work. To strengthen intelligence, the Public Vigilance and Security Office was created. Surveillance or counterintelligence was encouraged within their controlled areas to eliminate would-be traitors. Reconnaissance operations were also sent out in order to know the actual and prospective moves of the enemies. During the Filipino-American War, infiltration was successful. The Filipinos were able to enter Manila without being detected and sabotaged some portions of Manila. For example, the saboteurs burned buildings, and while the Americans were busy putting out the fire, they were also busy cutting the water hose. Aside from infiltrators and saboteurs, Filipinos sent liquidators, purposely to kill Americans, through what is called as gapang or dukat system. So that messages will reach their destination faster, mounted guards were employed. The use of secret name or nom de guerre continued. For example, Mariano Ramirez as Migate Gimagaps, Silvestre Tamanes as Salvapstgo Nematops, Guillermo Balesta as Tri, and Vicente Villamer as Karut, to name a few. Deception as one of the modus operandi in intelligence was also used. One of these is called the Amigo Act or false collaboration. In this strategy, members of the revolutionary forces pretended to be friendly and cooperative with the invaders. Through this they, Filipinos, were able to collect information about the Americans. They also used codes like Kurs to mean guns, Bapal to mean disembark there, Vibigops to mean ships, Pitdapes to mean flag, and Tyrandos de for to mean firing at each other. Watchers or guards, and couriers, were also dispatched from time to time. In fact, intelligence was given a special concern by the men of Aguinaldo, as shown by a captured document dated January 1, 1900. First, to defend this mother country against the American nation. Second, to collect supplies through the cabecillas and to prevent the sale of food, especially rice and meat. Third, to spy, emphasis by the author on the enemy, and send information of all his movements, and fourth, to put to death all person who resist the objectives of the society or give information concerning it. To sabotage the Americans, the Filipinos had executed a number of raids all over the country using their bolos. Filipinos, who used blade weapons because they did not have enough arms and ammunition, were considered as savages. There were a number of ways too in killing the Americans and those Filipinos who collaborated with the Americans, driving the non-member natives helpless because they were torn between two barbaric fighters, the Filipinos and the Americans. Even though the Americans had controlled the media, the Filipinos were still able to publish anti-American propaganda. John Morgan Gates, in his School Books and Crags, describes this propaganda thereby. It pictures the Americans as barbarians who had destroyed American natives and would do the same in the Philippines. Propaganda. During the second phase of the revolution, they have also La Independencia and El Heraldo de la Revolución as their propaganda newsletter. Intelligence during American regime. Before the capture of the Filipino patriots, popularly known as bandits and fanatics by the Americans, the Philippine Constabulary was already organized in 1901. Though it was just a sort of a national police, but by training and organization it had a military character. The members of this institution were also Filipinos, but for fear that there will be a revival of the insurgency, Filipinos were not given high-powered guns and high positions within the organization. The capture of Emilio Aguinaldo and the death of Luciano San Miguel, allegedly the last revolutionary leader, did not end the resistance. In fact, even after Aguinaldo swore allegiance to the United States of America, he was still consulted for some advice by the Filipino revolutionaries, erroneously called as insurgents. One of these messengers sent was Manuel Luis Quezon, then a major of the Revolutionary Army. This resistance continued all over the archipelago. Victor Hurley in his Jungle Patrol, believes that its origin can be traced to the original Katipunan. Later on this resistance was reported and published as brigandage. But for General Arthur MacArthur it was a continuation of the resistance. Lacking with arms and ammunition, they adopted again their time-tested strategy religious approach, thus they were also branded as fanatics. The different groups were, the Santa Iglesia, Dios, Babaylanes, Mont Estes, Colorum, Tulisan, Coloratus, Cruz, Cazadores, Santo Nios, Guardia de Honor, Hermano del Tercio Orden, Anting, and the Pulajanes. The basic similarity of all these groups was their adherence to amulets or Anting. It was not an all-out fanaticism but only a strategy because the liberty of the country was still their rallying point. In other words, Anting is only a means to recruit more members. People were made to believe that the raids conducted by these fanatical groups were for the personal gains of their leaders. Brigandage or piracy was their means of collecting much-needed logistics. It was their means of punishing American supporters. It was basically simple sabotage in order to undermine American rule. They also instituted tortures to frighten would-be supporters of the American. The term fanatics, as they were popularly called, did not only emanate from their use of Anting, but also from the style of their raids. They had no tactics, Americans commented, because they attacked in mass. In military strategy these were unsound, but for the desperados there were no other means. They had no guns, and if ever they had, they lacked the ammunition. For fighters whose weapons were bolos, the only strategy was to attack in mass and at close range. They add fury to their combat with their war cry tated. Their strategy varies, but most of the time hand-to-hand combat is used. The leaders utilized every native strategy that the jungle offered in order to win. Later on the constabulary reversed the situation. This happened when the units became majority Filipinos. Learning from experience, they did not wait anymore for the coming of the so-called fanatics, but they instead attacked their stronghold. Aside from their Filipino soldiers, they also hired Filipino guides, runners, and Secret Service operatives. But this did not succeed all the time, because of fear. For those who were captured by the fanatics, they suffered the punishments like burying in the ant house, or even eating them. Since there was a reversal of strategy, the fanatics defended their strongholds by having suyaks man traps and balitics spring traps around. They also posted lookouts that used budayong or shell horns as their warning device. They employed deception, and propaganda too. But what was horrible was their use of children as executioners of their to instill in them hatred against the enemies, to embolden them to fight. In Mindanao similar phenomenon happened. The Americans and their Filipino men encountered the Moros, whose fanaticism did not depend on any anting, but their faith in Islam. The Americans used the same strategy that they used in other areas. They hired the Moros to fight against the Moros. The soldiers were called by the Maraneos as Sandaros, guides and spies as Palaticos, and the marginal agents as Amigos. In Jolo and the Maguindanao the same thing happened. However, there were instances when these hired Moros turned against their masters, thus complicating the situation. The phenomenon in Visayas and Luzon of the so-called fanatics, when it comes to their raids, was surpassed in Jolo by the Juramentadus. Basically these two forms of warfare were religiously inspired, because if the Moros performed certain rites before waging an attack, so did the fanatics of Luzon and the Visayas. Their difference lies on the strategy. While the fanatics retreated when the situation comes to worse, the Juramentadus did not. They had their own system of communication too. As their warning devices, they used wooden drums and kites. They had code words too. Banditry or piracy was a constant headache to the constabulary. For the Americans and the victims these activities were mere brigandage, but for the members of the resistance these were sabotage, and a good source of logistics. This was the general term used to describe the members of the resistance all over the archipelago. With the foregoing discussions, we can say that the Americans used the Filipinos against the Filipinos, or the famous divide and rule, hence they succeeded. It should have been sooner had the Americans armed the Filipino constables with high-powered guns. But for fear of possible mutiny it took them a long time to trust the Filipinos. The Filipino constables did not have to learn intelligence the hard way because they have the same approach as the other groups. This was the reason why their resistance did not succeed, because the Americans knew their strategies through the use of their hired Filipino soldiers. This chapter showed that Filipinos had a similar intelligence approach from the first arrival of the Spaniards till the American period. It was only modified to suit the needs of the fighters.